Wow, what a time. I spent the past month bartending at a hostel in the south of Vietnam. So I've been working 3 jobs and I've been socializing until I don't know what is up or down, who's French or Dutch. And honestly, I'm just beautifully exhausted. But exhausted I am. I'll tell you all about that in the next episode, though. For now, I want to talk to you about hunger. Strange appetites, female villainy, and cannibalism. And yes, of course, I'm talking about the Lost and Found book club pick for August, which was A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers. And this is one of the most unsettling, honest, fun, gruesome, sexy, delicious books I have ever read. So let's get into it. Welcome back to Lost and Found, the podcast where we're figuring things out in real time together. I'm your host, Carmen Vit, and today we're sinking our teeth into, or maybe skinning open, this 2020 smash hit literary thriller that has been equal parts devoured and spat out by its readers. And this is A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers. So the novel follows Dorothy Daniels, who is this brilliant and unapologetic hedonistic food writer, and she has appetites that extend way beyond Michelin-starred menus. She hungers for food, for sex, and yes, for human flesh. So Dorothy is a serial killer who murders her lovers and consumes them. Carefully, right? Because she's a food critic. She's all about detail. So she chooses which body part best reflects the man, and then she prepares it with the refinement of a critic who has spent a lifetime pairing textures and flavors. So think tongues, livers, kidneys, and she takes these from her lovers after she kills them, and then she sears them with olive oil, and she drizzles it with reduction and plates it beside late summer tomatoes and washes it down with the perfect bottle of wine. So eventually, of course, she does make one stupid mistake and she's caught. So the book itself is framed as a memoir that she writes from Bedford Hills prison after her trial and after she is sentenced to life in prison. But let us make no mistake. This quote-unquote memoir, it's not a guilty confession. No. This for her is like a gleeful, narcissistic tell-all. It's a glossy, gory exhibition where she really shows off her lovers, her murders, and her menus with pride. But, I don't think this is really a story about cannibalism at all. I think it's a biting commentary on female desire, on hunger, and on storytelling itself. Because it's visceral and satirical and unapologetic and, yes, at times really unsettling, which makes it one of those polarizing books that readers either absolutely love or they absolutely hate. And I, for one, I loved it. So in this episode, I want to walk you through the narrative landscape of A Certain Hunger, theme by theme. And I want to unpack not just what makes Dorothy such a fascinating character for us, but what this book has to say about women and appetites and the act of telling stories itself. So firstly, and I think most importantly, is this theme of female villainy as feminism. So often in literature, women are given 3 main roles. They're either the victim, the moral compass, or this redemptive figure, the angel in the house. Women either suffer, or they guide, or they save. But Dorothy Daniels refuses all 3. She is unapologetically cruel and calculating and self-indulgent. And these are traits that, when men possess them, we kind of celebrate under this label of anti-hero. So think of figures like Humbert Humbert in Lolita or Patrick Bateman in American Psycho. When it's a man, we call it complexity. But when it's a woman, we call it monstrous, right? And that stretches so far into so many aspects of life, not just literature. But this is exactly what makes Dorothy so provocative. So by allowing a woman to fully embody villainy, Summers reframes it as a feminist act. Dorothy refuses to be likable. She refuses to be palatable. Yes, pun intended. So she's not written for our comfort, and she's not here to redeem herself. She insists on taking up a narrative space that women are so rarely permitted. And that insistence alone is unsettling, because we as readers are so conditioned to demand softness, or at the very least, an explanation from women, and especially from women who seem to, quote unquote, do something wrong in a book. We expect there to be some kind of explanation or a reason why they do this. But Dorothy obviously does not have this reason. The only reason she has is her hunger, her desire. So I think this connects really well with the feminist film theorist Barbara Creed. And she wrote this book, The Monstrous Feminine, that I just absolutely idolized when I was in university. So Creed talks about how women in horror are often cast as monstrous precisely when their desires break the boundaries of what society allows. And Dorothy doesn't just break those boundaries, she kind of dances over them. She embraces her monstrosity as power. And in doing so, she flips that gaze. She's not the victim, nor is she the object of horror. She is the horror itself. And this is a question I ask myself a lot throughout the book. Is this empowering? Does giving Dorothy space to be this kind of villain crack open something new in literature? Or does it risk reinforcing old fears about women's desires being like dangerous or destructive? I don't know. I lean more towards the empowering side, but maybe it's both. Maybe that's what makes her so fascinating. She doesn't let us settle on an easy answer. Think about that. The second theme I want to touch on is this theme of hunger and appetite as rebellion. Dorothy's appetites are not just large, they're voracious. She wants food, and she writes so eloquently about food. I mean, one moment I can't even look at meat because she's just describing how she's eating this man's tongue, even though I'm a vegetarian. And in the next chapter, she writes so beautifully about a cup of espresso in the sun or a plate of spaghetti drizzled with olive oil. So I go from being disgusted to hungry in the span of about a few pages, which is really interesting. But yeah, so she wants food, she wants sex, and ultimately, she wants human flesh. But what's fascinating is that her hunger pushes beyond indulgence into provocation. It isn't simply that she enjoys good wine or oysters or olive oil, but it's that her appetite becomes this metaphor for desire, for power, and for the radical right to want without restraint. And that's where it gets uncomfortable, because appetite, especially for women, has always been policed. We're told to eat less, right? Think about it. Why are we told to eat less? So that we can be smaller, not as powerful, not take up so much space. We need to temper our desires. We need to be contained, quiet, ladylike, manageable. From diet culture to slut shaming, women are trained to shrink not only our bodies but our wants. And Dorothy refuses. She doesn't just eat, she devours. And she doesn't just desire, she takes. And yes, at times it feels grotesque and maybe even repulsive, but that's what makes it radical. She forces us to ask, what if women's hungers weren't suppressed? What if they were celebrated even when they're ugly and even when they scare us? Now, this connects directly to one of my favorite feminist scholars, Susan Bordo. And she wrote this book, Unbearable Weight. She writes about how women's bodies, and by extension, their appetites, are sites of patriarchal control. So to resist appetite and to starve oneself is often framed as virtue or discipline or as something good. And to embrace appetite is to risk being labeled unruly or excessive or monstrous or too much, right? We know this. But Dorothy flips the script. Her grotesque hungers become a kind of rebellion, not just against men, but against a culture that demands women constantly regulate themselves. Now that reminds me of that famous quote by Naomi Wolf in her book, The Beauty Myth. I'm sure you've seen it somewhere. And it reads, "A culture fixated on female thinness is not an obsession about female beauty, but an obsession about female obedience." And Dorothy embodies the opposite of obedience. Her body, her wants, her cravings, they're untamed. And that is what unsettles us as much as the cannibalism itself. And so I think we should ask ourselves, what really makes Dorothy's hunger so shocking to us? Is it actually the cannibalism, the gore, the violence? Or is it the fact that she's a woman who refuses restraint? A woman who insists on wanting more, always more, without apology? Okay, the third theme I want to touch on is consumption or cannibalism as intimacy. Think about it. So much of the language we use around love and sex is already steeped in metaphors of appetite. We say things like, we're starving for someone's touch. We call our lovers delicious. We talk about devouring them with kisses. So desire really is, in the cultural imagination, framed as hunger. And what Dorothy does is take that metaphor and make it literal, because she actually consumes her lovers, bite by bite. And yes, on the surface, it's horrifying. But when you think about it, there's something, I want to say, strangely honest. Because intimacy often does blur into this urge to consume, to merge, and to collapse the boundary between the self and the other. And Freud called this the oral stage, the first form of desire we know, where satisfaction comes through the mouth, through taking the world into ourselves. And Lacan expands on that, describing desire as something we can never fully satisfy. We're always reaching, always consuming, but it's never fully satiating us. And then, of course, you have Georges Bataille, who in Eroticism argues that sex, violence, and consumption are all tied together by transgression, and that our most intimate acts are also our most destructive ones. Why? Because they dissolve these boundaries between bodies, between identities. And in that sense, Dorothy's cannibalism isn't just grotesque, it's almost the ultimate expression of intimacy, because she's collapsing every boundary, making her lovers literally a part of herself. And here I think is where it gets even more interesting, because in pop culture, the stereotype is usually the opposite. There's this idea that women are the ones who get consumed. Women are supposedly the ones who lose themselves in relationships, who dissolve into their partner's life and forget themselves in love. And we've all seen it, or maybe we've lived it, that dim-witted, all-in-one, all-sacrificing love where you almost stop being you. But Dorothy flips this again. She's the one who consumes. She takes the men into herself, makes them literally a part of her body. And this choice, I think, becomes especially striking when you think about Alex, the one man she actually loved and fell in love with. And do you remember the scene where they're at the top of the Empire State Building and he's proposing to her, and she looks down and she takes a beat and she rejects the marriage proposal. And she specifically says it's not because she can't imagine a life with him, but because she couldn't imagine a life as her Alex self, as she calls it. So the self she is with Alex, she didn't like that tame, nice, softened version of herself that she became around him. And to marry Alex would have meant being gulped into his life and his identity forever. And so instead, she chooses herself, the self that she likes better, the cruel, selfish version, the Dorothy with the sharp edges, all the parts of her that felt truer to her. And honestly, as twisted as Dorothy is, that choice is fucking relatable. Because how many of us have had that moment where we realize that this love that we have, is starting to erase us. And the only way to keep ourselves intact is to walk away. I think that moment for me, honestly, was the point where she was most relatable. But maybe that says too much about my romantic past, so I'm gonna leave it right there. That point leads nicely into this next theme, the one of satirical culinary writing and the way the book kind of plays with genre. So Summers uses this lush, sensual language of food writing to describe murder. Dorothy's lovers aren't just victims, they're also entrees and main courses and desserts. So she pairs them with olive oil and tomatoes and the right kind of vintage wine. Violence in this book is plated like fine dining, and that blurs the line between a 5-star meal and a crime scene. And this is where the book gets really funny in a dark way, because it's not just a cannibalism story. It's also a satire of foodie culture and how we tend to fetishize taste, presentation, and consumption. This immediately made me think of Anthony Bourdain's critiques. But also, there are so many food study scholars who talk about how modern gastronomy is less about nourishment now, and lately it's more about status and identity and performance. And Dorothy takes that culture to its most grotesque conclusion. And then, of course, there's the gender angle, because food and cooking and food writing has often been feminized. Think of things like recipes, domestic labor, that stereotype of the nurturing mother in the kitchen. But again, Dorothy subverts that. She doesn't cook to feed a family. She cooks to indulge herself. And she wields the language of cuisine with violence, precision, and unapologetic selfishness. She takes this feminized form, something that we relate with domesticity and nurturing care, and she uses it as power. And in doing so, she unsettles both the literary and the culinary genres that she's working inside of. So the satire is double-edged. It mocks the absurdities of foodie excess while also asking why women's appetites, culinary or otherwise, have always been made to feel either domestic or dangerous. There's never a gray area, right? The final theme I want to explore is writing as exhibitionism. And tied to that is our complicity as readers. Like I said in the beginning, Dorothy doesn't write this memoir to confess out of guilt. There's no remorse here. There's no plea for forgiveness. She confesses because she wants to be seen. Her narration is a performance. It's an exhibition. And that phrase she uses, the naked, pulsating will to tell, that captures it perfectly. She revels in her own storytelling, and she's dragging us into complicity. Even when we're horrified, we're still reading. We're still consuming, right? And that says something about us too, about our appetite for gore and for taboo and for this thrill of the forbidden. And then the act of reading itself becomes almost as transgressive as Dorothy's actions. It blurs the line between her exhibitionism and our voyeurism. She kind of strips herself bare on the page, and yet we keep watching. We can't look away, even though we know we probably should. This idea reminded me a lot of Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, where he talks about confession as a mechanism of power in Western culture. And traditionally, confession is about discipline, right? Because think about it, we confess to priests and to doctors and to institutions who judge or correct us in some way. But Dorothy refuses this framework. Her confession is not about guilt at all. It's about pleasure. And she wields it as power. She doesn't hand over her narrative to be judged. She brandishes it. What she's really doing is she's daring us to look, daring us to flinch. Dorothy wants to be seen, and we keep reading. She offers herself up in this full grotesque spectacle, but we're the ones who give that performance meaning by consuming it. That's interesting. I want to go further and link this with reader response theory from scholars like Stanley Fish and Wolfgang Iser. So they argue that meaning isn't just in the text, but in the act of reading itself. And it's co-created between the author and the audience, which means that we are made guilty right alongside Dorothy. Her words wouldn't land, and it wouldn't thrill, and it wouldn't horrify without our eyes on the page. Meaning, we are complicit in the pleasure of her exhibitionism. And now I want to ask you, after listening to all of that, what is the real transgression here? Is it the murders, the cannibalism, the gore? Or is it our own enjoyment of reading about them? Is Summers critiquing us for finding Dorothy so magnetic? Or is she simply exposing the darker appetites we already know we have? It's fascinating. This excites me so much. I love being able to talk about this and think and wonder whether you like the book or not. Please let me know your answers to these questions, even if you aren't in the book club. Send them to me via email, DM me. I want to know what you thought about this book. Or even if you didn't read the book, what do you think about these concepts of female villainy as feminism? Do you think it's empowering? What do you think of the ideas writing as exhibitionism? I want to know. I want to talk about this. Anyway, to close, I want to circle back to my own experience of reading A Certain Hunger. This book really made me laugh out loud at times. And then it made me squirm with discomfort. And then at times it really sent me reaching for my journal to reflect on my own patterns of love and desire. And at one point, I won't be able to look at food because it made me so nauseous. And then a few pages later, like I said, I'm craving spaghetti or a cup of espresso in the sun. And that's really the range it put me through. That, for me, is the real success of this novel. Not whether you liked Dorothy, not whether you can stomach the gore, but the fact that the book really makes you feel. It is visceral, unexpected, uncomfortable. It pushes you into spaces that most books are too polite to touch, and it dares you to stay there. So maybe hunger and villainy and desire aren't the real taboos after all. Maybe the deeper taboo is admitting that we want to read about them on some level. And that on some level, we enjoy peering into the dark because it tells us something about ourselves. If you're telling me you didn't relate to any little part of Dorothy, as a woman, I want to tell you you're lying, because I definitely, uncomfortably, related to her at some points. And that's why I loved this book. It unsettled me, and it entertained me, and it made me complicit all at once. Whether you loved it or hated it, A Certain Hunger is doing exactly what literature should do, refusing to leave you unchanged. Okay, now, drum roll please. Our pick for September is Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. This is a complete change of pace from A Certain Hunger. So where Dorothy Daniels was loud and visceral, satirical and bloody, Lahiri's stories are quiet and tender and piercing in their simplicity. Interpreter of Maladies is gonna take us into the lives of characters moving between India and the Indian American immigrant experience. She writes about marriages on the brink, unspoken longings, moments of loneliness and connection that feel really personal and specific, but also completely universal. I chose this collection of short stories because, yes, it's obviously beautifully written, but also I just finished 3 months of traveling through India, and I was really struck by how profoundly rich the literary tradition is. But it also made me realize how little exposure we in the West often get to Indian writers, and I think this book is such a beautiful doorway into that world. And it's very accessible. I think it's around 200 pages, maybe less. Perfect for you if you want to get back into reading, find your groove. And also perfect for you if you haven't really dipped your toes into short form literature. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning debut for a reason. And I think that after the excess and provocation of this last book, this one will ask us to slow down and sit with the silences and to notice the subtler hungers and heartbreaks that shape human lives. And no cannibalism, I promise. If you want to read along with us, you'll find the link to join the Lost and Found Book Club in the description. So come join the chat, bring your thoughts, and let's read together. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and for reading along. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss what's coming next. And if you have a moment, please leave a quick rating or a review. It really helps the podcast reach the people that need to hear it most. And if you want to dive even deeper into my world, you can also find the link to my blog in the description, or you can buy my latest book, Untethered, A Beginner's Guide to Solo Travel. It's available on Amazon Kindle, or you can buy it directly on my website as a PDF, carmenvit.com. I'll see you on Thursday. But until then, don't forget to get a little bit lost. That's where the magic finds you.